Welcome to BSides Orlando. Our next speaker is the founder of Cyber Centaurs, a digital forensics and cybersecurity company, and he is also the founder of Data Analyzers, a data recovery firm. He leads research and development, as well as critical engagements involving digital forensics and incident response. He has over 15 years of IT experience and has developed expertise in data recovery, cybersecurity, and digital forensics. He is vice president of Orlando InfraGuard and holds numerous industry certifications such as the CISSP, CCE, CEH, CHFI, GCFE, and GCFA. I get a prize for getting all that right. He has been quoted in Forbes magazine and has testified as an expert witness in both state and federal courts. Please help me welcome Andrew von Ramin Mapp.
Can you see what I have here? It's advanced technology. What is it? Flash drive. Okay. I bet what you didn't know is that I have your company's trade secrets on here. Yep, it's kind of a long story, but I'll tell it to you anyways. This sales executive that I know, she left your company, and she wanted to go work for a competitor, better benefits, better salary, more commissions. And so she decided that there were some documents that were of value to her and quite interesting. And so she decided to grab those documents and download them from the corporate intranet onto a Dropbox account. And she took those documents with her, all confidential trade secrets of the sales process and procedures. And she asked me if I wanted a copy of it, so I said, well, sure, why not? It's actually quite some interesting stuff on here, especially when we're looking at the unique content for the actual sales process and how your company is actually acquiring new clients, and it's a quite interesting and unique approach. Does anyone else want a copy of it? Yeah. So, yes, but seriously, one of the biggest issues that we have when it comes to protecting our corporate data is not only protecting our data from adversaries, but also protecting our data from employees that potentially have ill-minded thoughts about what to do with the data. And I would go so far and to argue that the number one threat to your corporation or your organization's data are not nation-state attacks with zero-day exploits. It's not script kiddies that are exploiting some old vulnerability that wasn't patched. Matter of fact, I would say it's not even ransomware, but it's the actual threat from within. Now, given all of these components certainly are threats that we need to watch out for and threats that we need to combat, but too often the threat from within is neglected, and we put almost all of our eggs in one basket in fighting off the adversary, fighting off the evil hackers, and leave ourselves relatively vulnerable to simple inside threats. And we're not speaking necessarily about a sophisticated IT individual that is able to cause a lot of havoc in the organization, but we're talking about your average employee, maybe at a management position or so in sales or business development, that has access to information that they need to have access to for their day-to-day business operations. But if they were to obtain and exfiltrate that data and share that with a competitor or sell it off, it would cause some tremendous issues to the organization. So my point here is that the threat from within is something that should not be neglected, and we need to pay more attention to that. In particular, we've been seeing a strong increase of data theft by employees, and that's really what we're going to cover here. So we're going to jump right into the presentation. And when we're talking about data theft, I'm particularly going to focus on data theft via the cloud, because we've seen a huge spike in this type of activity over the past 3-4 years. And there is just something about the cloud that makes it so seductive for employees to grab some data and just transfer it onto their personal cloud storage device. So the reason I'm giving this presentation, or to give you a little bit of background about myself first, I'm originally from Germany, been here in Orlando now for about 15 years or so. I run 2 companies, a data recovery company and a cybersecurity company called Cyber Centaurs, where we predominantly work with law enforcement agencies. We work with law firms, corporations, and municipalities, and we've assisted in some high-profile investigations here in the state. But what I'm really here today is to talk to you about the data theft that we've been seeing in a drastically increasing number of incidents in our investigations when we've been assisting clients. So why am I doing this? It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it, right? No one wants to talk about, well, what is if employees are stealing information? I don't want to stand up here and make employees out to be the bad guys, because 99.9% of all employees are hardworking and are ethical and would never do such a thing. But it only requires one, and that one incident that can be crucial and devastating. So just imagine for a moment from a business perspective, if an employee, let's say in a sales department, copies off a list of clients and potential clients and takes that to the competitor, and that company all of a sudden starts losing about 50% of its client base, that is something that could bring the company to its knees and can bankrupt the company, or at least, best case scenario, it'll take the company years to recover from that. Versus from a cyber breach, of course, depending on how severe the cyber breach is and what was involved, but oftentimes you can hire a skilled public relations firm to assist with media control and PR damages to try to improve the situation and the persona of the company again. So let's jump right into this. So what do we see more frequently than threat actors? And this is when we're investigating corporations, we're investigating with municipalities. Does anyone have an idea? Well, it's the threat from within. I mean, the theme that I'm covering here. So data breaches by employees, oftentimes that have additional permissions that they shouldn't have to the network, folders, databases, things of that nature. The Verizon data breach report had made a study and determined that 77% of all data breaches either occurred from the inside or had an inside component attached to that. So while we're focusing all of our efforts on shielding the network from the outside adversary, oftentimes we find that we're not doing enough to shield ourselves from within. So some of this, what it actually includes when we're looking at data breaches from within, it includes access that is granted, that is not restricted sufficiently, which not only includes employees, but also includes contractors. We're talking about copying of trade secrets that sometimes have been copied without intent. And we're talking about copying of trade secrets and intellectual property with the intent of, and when we say here with intent, it's with intent for nefarious activities. So copying trade secrets without the intent can be a scenario such as a software developer copies a piece of code. He or she doesn't really have any plan on selling it to a competitor or doing anything with it, but that individual just thought it was a cool piece of code and wanted it for their own collection. Versus with intent, at that point, we're talking about causing harm to the organization or doing it with the intent to have financial gain by selling it off, starting an own company, going to a competitor with that information to assist the competitor in causing havoc to that organization and removing its clients. So we've identified basically 3 key employee types where we're seeing these type of issues pop up over and over again. And of course, there's going to be some other areas, but from our investigations, this has kind of covered 98% of it. And that is mid to senior level sales executives, which has pretty much been the bulk. Then business development executives. And then third, but not least, software developers. And mid and senior level sales executives, oftentimes, they will focus on grabbing client lists, potential client lists, sales procedures, price lists, and things of that nature. With business development executives, it's oftentimes very similar. And then software developers, obviously, some type of code that either they wrote themselves, but on company time, and the code belongs to the organization, or someone else wrote the code in the organization, and they wanted to have that piece of code for their own use. Now, one interesting fact from our investigations is that in probably about 95 cases, or 95% of the cases, it's been all by males. So we've seen very little employee data theft by females. So take that for what it is. Don't hire any more men, right? Okay, so why do we see such a drastic increase of employee data theft? And the reason is it's become very easy to copy off data from a corporate network or a cloud platform. And it's been relatively difficult to combat because realistically, when you're trying to oversee hundreds or thousands of employees, it becomes very difficult to micromanage the data access. And even if you do have teams and platforms in place to do that, oversight oftentimes just happens because everyone is so busy working on projects and deadlines, and there's just hundreds or even thousands of employees to do. So there's 4 main areas of data exfiltration, and when we refer to data exfiltration, that's the terminology basically for data theft, where we're exfiltrating data from where it is to where it should not be. So there's 4 main components of how data is exfiltrated. The first one being cloud services. The second one being USB thumb drives. The third one being webmail attachments, and then transfer to smartphones. Some of these are more easier to combat than others. For example, USB thumb drives. A good approach there, obviously, is just disabling the access to the USB ports. webmail attachments, having proxy servers or firewalls that block out webmail altogether, while not 100% foolproof, is going to combat at least 90% or more. So what we're really going to focus on here is cloud services. And when we're talking about cloud services, we're referring to client-based cloud services. Pardon me. Can everyone still hear me? Okay. So we're talking about client and consumer-based cloud services. So in this instance, we're not talking about the Amazon cloud, or we're not talking about any cloud-hosted servers, but essentially container buckets that are freely available to anyone to use, such as Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, Box.com, Mega, et cetera, et cetera. And since these are popping up everywhere and are freely available and accessible, everyone can basically create an account and can copy data onto them. And that's really the issue with that it's become so accessible that is just starting to become very seductive, and we're seeing more and more of that. And so, to go back to that, the reason why it's becoming so seductive and interesting is from a perspective of committing a crime. There's a few things that usually have to come together to really make it enticing. I mean, you always have some people that are just nefarious by nature or been so a long time and will look for any opportunity to commit a crime. But that's not the majority of people. And if you study any type of criminal statistics, that's not the majority of what happens. The average person is just like you and I, that lives an average life and tries to uphold their ethics and be a good be of good service in the community, et cetera, et cetera. But when certain things come together, that's oftentimes when there is somewhat of a catalyst to commit a crime. And those components are usually 4 components. One being something actually happened in that individual's personal life, such as an issue with a relationship, a financial issue, a health issue, something that causes this person to panic and act out of their normal circumstances. The second being, there has to be some type of a platform or some type of a device or tool that's easily accessible. If you're thinking about committing a crime and the tool that you need to do it's going to cost you $2.5 million, then you're probably going to not do it and go back to read a book or something. But if those tools are readily available and they're cheap or even better free, then that becomes enticing. The third component is it needs to be easy. And if something is very complicated, it's usually going to deter you. So if it's cheap or free and it's easy for you to utilize, and the third component really being that there is a high chance that you actually can get away with it or think you can get away with it. If these 4 components come together, it causes a huge catalyst, and individuals that sometimes are prone to conducting certain behaviors that they shouldn't can easily be persuaded, not even necessarily by others, but by their own mind to engage in these type of actions. So most employee terminations, when we're looking at data theft from that perspective, what we're seeing in terms of how data theft really happens in the real world is that cloud service accounts are not being disabled properly or not being disabled on time, or someone forgot to disable the cloud accounts. CRM platforms such as Salesforce, again, are not being disabled sometimes. The user access is not being disabled, or the user had too much access and was able to export data entries, client names, client lists, things of that nature that they shouldn't be able to do. And then the other component that we don't see as frequent, but surprisingly we do see it happen, is that someone forgot to disable the VPN access. So usually someone in IT forgot to disable the VPN access for an employee that was terminated. An employee finds out, oh, my VPN is still working. Let me just try and connect and see what's there. So let's jump into some case studies here. We were contacted a while ago by an international corporation about a high-level sales executive that had left the company and went over to pretty much their main competitor. Now, this company, they were pretty certain that this key employee in their sales division had to have taken some information from the corporation and shared it with their competitor. However, they did their own internal investigation, and they weren't able to find anything of substance or any type of evidence to really back that up. The reason why they were so concerned and the reason why they so strongly felt that the employee had taken information was because in that particular geographical region, which was a very high profit region for them, they were starting to lose clients left and right. So while they weren't able to prove it at the time, they felt very, very strongly that somehow the employee had to have taken some client databases and client lists with him. So we ended up having a conference call with the organization, and after we spoke to the CIO and the general counsel, basically the chief legal officer of the organization, we took on the case and we started an investigation. First, we didn't find anything. We're looking at the same results that they were looking at from internal investigations, right? Basically, we were just looking puzzled into the headlights like a pack of deers. But then something was revealed to us by the corporation. And it is that the sales executive had two laptops, one which we had already investigated and didn't find anything with, and then a second laptop, which conveniently he took with him after termination and did not turn over that second laptop until after an audit 4 weeks later. They figured out, wait a minute, we're missing a laptop here. Who has it? Oh, it was the sales executive that left, and reluctantly he turned it over. So once we got our hands on that laptop and we investigated it, we actually started finding some things that looked a little bit more interesting. We started seeing logs such as this right here. Does anyone know what we're looking at here? Okay, so essentially, we found logs that showed in the event log that that individual was establishing a VPN connection back to that company. And obviously, that was after the time that he was already terminated, and he should have not been authorized to connect to the corporate network. Nevertheless, he did because the VPN access was not disabled. And not only did he connect, but he also downloaded the documents that were in question, several PDF and Excel spreadsheets that had client databases, potential clients, high-profile clients, and projects that they were bidding on. And so he did take that information to the competitor. So it was very interesting And what we found out in addition to that, that really was somewhat unique, is that when we tried to look from the corporate perspective and look at the corporate network logs, and on the corporate side, we didn't really find any of that information. So we were looking for basically the second component. We had a connection from the laptop that we could see, but we were looking on the corporate side to also see those logs so that we can ensure that they fit perfectly like a glove, and that from an investigation standpoint, that was going to be very solid. However, that component just wasn't there. And one of the individuals that was assigned to assisting us on the corporate side was making it very difficult for us to try to get any logs, and made it very difficult for us to get any type of information, and just prolonged and prolonged and prolonged until we spoke to the IT director and found out that those logs were not there. We ended up having the IT director grab those logs from some tape backups and provide them to us, and we ended up finding the previous logs that confirmed the VPN connection. And essentially, what we found out by further investigating was that not only were those logs deleted, but anyone knows? Any ideas?
Well, wait, there's more.
There is more. That's right. There's always more. But what we found out was that the employee in the IT department, part of the network admin group that was responsible for disabling the VPN access, went ahead and actually purged the logs and knew that the connection was established, and he was so concerned that someone was going to find out and that he was going to get terminated, that he disabled or basically purged all access logs on their current SIEM that related to that time period. And needless to say, it made the investigation a whole lot more difficult and more time-consuming and more costly, et cetera, and in the end, the employee in the IT department was terminated for that action, versus if he would have just been upfront, he probably would have gotten a slap on the wrist and, be more careful next time. So we have another case study that we're going to cover, and this time it was a Fortune 1000 company that had contacted us to investigate a contractor of theirs. They found some logs showing that the contractor was doing something fishy. Something weird was going on there that they were certain of, but they couldn't quite confirm their suspicions. Their suspicions were that the contractor was downloading contracts and proposals and bids that related to a very different project, and his employer would have been able to basically see the scope, see what the competitors had proposed, and essentially outbid all of the competitors by having that internal information. Now, they did their own investigation. They captured a bunch of PCAP logs, but it was all SSL and TSL traffic, so they really couldn't do anything with it. And they spoke to us. We said, we can take a look at it. And so we did. We took a look at the PCAP captures, and initially, when we did, we didn't find anything of value again, because the traffic was encrypted. Now, what we ended up doing, we grabbed the laptop, and in this instance, we really had a lot of luck. We grabbed the laptop that contractor was using at the time, and there was a hibernation file, and in that hibernation file, we did a raw recovery for the session key that we then used in Wireshark to essentially decrypt the SSL packets, and we started seeing things like this. I don't know if you can see it from here, but this says here 19-03 RFP-proposal A1-KMC0F12 PDF. And we found a whole bunch of these. And we correlated that these were actually proposals that were real and belonged to the client. And those were accessed from a box.com account. This particular organization was using box.com to provide access to all of their contractors for different projects. And this individual had additional access that for some reason he should not have had. And he had access to an additional folder that somehow by accident and oversight, he shouldn't have had access to that because it was for a totally different project, but it was a project that his organization was involved in, and it was, I think it was like a $50 or $100 million project. So it was by no means a small-scale project, and it ended up becoming a very big investigation, and it actually was a big thing that was covered, and all of the other contractors ended up finding out about it, and they all wanted a rebid of the proposals, and so it ended up being a nightmare for that organization. The other thing that we found out, which was interesting, is that not only did he download these files from a box.com account, but further, he actually utilized those files and transferred them from one cloud storage container to the next. Basically, he did cloud hopping to try to prevent from someone finding out who actually ended up taking those documents. So he downloaded that information, and he uploaded it from box.com to Dropbox, and then from Dropbox, he ended up transferring it to Mega. And then from Mega, we don't exactly know where it went, but in the end, we found out that when he ultimately downloaded it again onto his personal laptop, he did it through a Google Drive account. So we had the information from the box.com that led us to Dropbox, and we ended up getting some subpoena assistance, and were able to trace the IP addresses for Dropbox, and then that led us back to Mega. Mega was not cooperative, so we didn't find any more information that was helpful. However, at that point, we had sufficient probable cause to get a subpoena of the individual's personal laptop, and we ended up finding those same exact files being downloaded by a Google Drive account. And so he ended up hopping from box.com to Dropbox to Mega, possibly to a few more, all in trying to evade that he was the individual that was trying to download that information, then transferred it over to Google Drive and downloaded it to his personal laptop. So it was quite sneaky in that approach. So that's pretty much the conclusion. Those two case studies, and what I really wanted to leave you with and drive home is that when you go back to your companies and organizations on Monday, speak to everyone on the IT staff and conduct a proper audit on not only the security permissions that you have on your network for employees, but also where is the hot data. Create a data map that not only affects information that's pertained to compliance, such as HIPAA and PCI. So we're not just talking about the credit card information and sensitive user information, but we're talking about from a business operations, create a data map if it isn't already in place, where the data is that would be of the most harm if a competitor were to obtain that information. And then backtrack who has access to that information and how well is that information currently being protected, and try to reverse engineer that situation where someone on the IT team will take one of the sales accounts, for example, and see how much information they can actually get out. Same with laptops that are taken home or off-site. Do a proper audit on that, and hopefully that'll inspire your organization to drive home the fact that not only external data threats are big and growing concerns, but internal data threats by employees and data exfiltration are just as much, if not even a bigger security risk at the moment. And it's just going to continue to grow and continue as we're seeing more cloud accounts, bigger free storage spaces, and things of that in the nature. All right, do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
How long did the investigation take for the first case study from beginning to end?
Okay, so the first case study, what really caused somewhat of a big delay was that we needed to wait to get those backup tapes restored, and we literally had to wait about a month for that. Everything else in the investigation took about 3 weeks. So, nearly 2 months with the delay that we had to wait on these backup tapes to being restored. And, yes, sir?
So, a little bit of a background real quick. I'm getting ready to give a similar talk up in Jacksonville, and one of the things
No, out.
I'm going to relate to enforcing policy to prevent this stuff, to prevent these kind of things to happen. And so, is there any part of policy in this example that could have prevented this stuff from happening?
Good question. And yes. So, for example, there should be a proper, for example, the second, well, actually, no, the first case study with the VPN issue, policy-wise, there should be a proper procedure for employee termination, and whoever is essentially managing that should check off all the boxes and then sign that it has been conducted. So that usually is the best way from my experience of doing it. So it would be disabled Active Directory account, check. Disabled CRM database, check. Terminated VPN account, check. Sign, John Doe. In terms of the second one, I would say a frequent audit of user permissions. And what we see oftentimes is that everything is fine inside of the network, but once data gets moved out of the network in cloud storage containers, for some reason, it's kind of out of sight and out of mind, and it's not treated as organically as part of the entire whole data set. And so oftentimes when you're doing vulnerability assessments, audits, things of that nature, it's kind of just pushed to the side, not included or forgotten. So a audit on permissions of any type of cloud storage platforms that you have probably would have prevented that. Or it wouldn't have prevented the initial oversight, but it would have found the issue in terms of permissions, and it would have probably been able to be rectified prior to the incident. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
If I can interrupt for just one quick moment. If you have a question, could I ask you to come to the aisle microphone so that as we're recording, we can catch your questions as well?
On the second case, with the contractor, what controls were neglected by the company that could have prevented that? Should they have been sandboxing that contractor more?
Yes, so essentially the contractor had permissions to an additional folder hierarchy that he should not have had access to. So it should have been sandboxed to folder XYZ for project 123, and that was not the case. And it was a bit interesting because that contractor had worked on different projects at times. And from my understanding, he actually was working on 2 different projects simultaneously. So somehow that obscured his entire permission access, but still, it should have been sandboxed, yeah. Any other questions? Yes,
Hi,
ma'am.
how you doing?
Hello.
I actually have 2 questions. One, are you hiring? Because I'm less likely to sell secrets. And 2, do you guys give like remediation reports? Say if you find a port open that you know shouldn't be open, even though it wasn't part of the investigation, do you put that in your final report or such things like that?
Well, so simple answer is yes, yes, and yes. Yes, we actually are hiring. Yes, you're probably not going to steal any data. And yes, we do provide information on remediation. However, oftentimes, depending on what type of investigation or what we're doing, if we're doing like a penetration test or something security related, then we definitely have remediation. In the case of when we're doing an investigation for employee data theft or things of that nature, if we do provide remediation steps, it's usually a separate report because the first report oftentimes is utilized in the lawsuit or even in a criminal legal case. And so that information shouldn't really be in that particular case. We provide that separate then, but yes.
Hi, thank you. I have a follow-up on the contractor situation. Were there any legal ramifications? And the reason I ask that is, if that individual were to go to a different company, would something show up in a background check? Because most companies do a proper background check, right? At least you would hope so, but would that show up or would there be any legal ramifications?
Yes, there were legal ramifications, and from my understanding, they're still ongoing. It's a complex, it's a big organization and big contractors, it's a complex thing, so it sometimes gets drawn out for a long time. But yes, there is an investigation. More than likely, that individual will have a record.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
How do you deal with chain of custody for cloud services?
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Is there anything specific that you're...
So if you want to prosecute somebody in court, I'm assuming you need to bring evidence. Are there any chain of custody elements that need to be adhered to?
Well,
specific to cloud services?
Essentially, it's no different. It's not much different than any other forensic investigation. So once the data has been identified, there has to be a chain of custody, as in who's the individual who essentially obtained the data, and then anyone else who's working on examining or analyzing the data will have to sign a proper chain of custody form. So in most of those cases, there isn't anything required from the actual cloud hosting provider, but it starts with whoever identifies and collects the information. So in other words, if I identify the information in the cloud and I download it and I hand it over to one of my employees for investigation, I would sign off on that, then that individual would sign off on that, and then if we hand it over to an attorney, then that attorney would sign off on that until it ultimately makes itself into the hands of law enforcement or into a courtroom. Now, usually if there is a subpoena process in place, usually we'll start the chain of custody then with the subpoena process. So in that case, if we do need to subpoena a cloud service provider, then the chain of custody starts right there with John Doe at box.com or whatever it is that released that information. Yes, sir.
Hey, so A lot of these cloud providers, some of them are better than others, right? Google Drive, for example, you have granular permissions, you can lock it down, you can prevent personal accounts, blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of them that, don't really have this stuff built in. And as there's hundreds and hundreds of these like cloud and SaaS providers that like become ingrained in companies' business processes, like what's a good strategy to help lock that kind of stuff down if the provider doesn't natively provide that functionality? Because it's really, the only reason Google Drive works the way it does because Google does that. They have that functionality built in, but a lot of them don't. So what do you do?
Right. Well, so a lot of the bigger ones now, they actually have enterprise accounts where you have to pay a little bit more, and then you actually have a lot more ability to lock down and audit. If not, although I don't really want to promote it, OneDrive is a good one in that instance, in that you can tie everything nicely back together. So best practice there is probably going with one of the bigger providers like Google, Microsoft. Right. Right, and some of them you can also whitelist or blacklist, IP addresses or IP address ranges. And I think we're almost done, but we probably have we may have time for maybe one more question, and then any other questions I can take.
We can take questions in the lobby.
Yeah.
Hear me? 'Cause
Now we can.
Okay. I'm a student, and I'm in digital forensics too now, and we've talked about cloud computing, and it's difficult. And now I wanted to understand, how did you go from Box.com to Dropbox to Mega without a subpoena? Or did you have a subpoena to get to all those cloud services to acquire that data? Because you're not allowed to get that. So how did you do that? Or how long did it take you to do all that?
Well, from Box.com, that was the corporate account, so we had access to that. And when it was copied over to Dropbox, we actually did get a subpoena for that. And then Mega, we did not get a subpoena, and that's why we lost the trace there. Because I'm not sure where they're still hosted, if it's in New Zealand or where it is at this point. But usually subpoenas, you'll have a lot more success with anything that's in the US or in the EU. Thank you.